perspective, and I think we are going to cover a lot of very interesting perspectives today. Again, I'm Jim Harper from the CATO Institute. We're a libertarian think tank here in DC, devoted to limited government, free markets, peace, and of course civil liberties. Since its inception, I've served on the Department of Homeland Security's Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee, or Privacy Committee. And I realized after a few years of interacting with DHS people that we would have to get a better handle on this terrorism problem if we were going to have our security well protected and our privacy well protected. There's a sort of culture at DHS, and I think there's a sort of culture among security people across the spectrum that tends to talk up threat, so that they honestly believe that just about anything they're doing is good for us and good for the country. But our pushback of the ACLU, the folks who put this panel together, and many other people across the country, is counterbalanced, an appropriate counterbalance to that conversation. So thanks to UDC Law School for having us here, and for the folks at the ACLU for putting us together. Like Hope, I agree that the pressures of your first year of law school and putting something like this together is too much. You shouldn't have done it, but thank you. So after a few years of working on the Privacy Committee, I realized we had to get a handle on terrorism, and so with colleagues of mine who are expert in foreign policy and defense, I've worked for several years now on strategic counterterrorism. A few years ago, we brought together 30+ experts for a 2-day meeting in Chicago. At the beginning of the Obama administration, we had a 2-day conference to sort of try to shape the direction of the administration on that. Mike German has been a participant in it, and many other experts. He's a bigger expert than you probably realize, and authored a terrific book on the subject of terrorism, Thinking Like a Terrorist. And we had another conference in January of 2010. We produced a book called Terrorizing Ourselves, and I think the title probably captures the concept that's very important to understand in the area of terrorism and counterterrorism, is that terrorism does its work by inducing fear on the part of the victim state, causing the victim state to overreact in ways that harm itself. So going to war, for example, wasting blood and treasure, abandoning civil liberties needlessly, doing things that harm populations that are ideologically or physically close to terrorists. These things all help the terrorism project, and they hurt us. They hurt us in terms of our own well-being, our liberties, our wealth, and our security from terrorism. So it's rather complicated. There are a lot of pieces of the puzzle to unpack, and one piece that I want to talk a little bit about today, that's an input into these legal questions, is the problem of risk management. What's reasonable is what manages these types of risks well. So it's helpful, I think, to everybody to think in terms of risk management, which is a complex area itself. There are many different areas where risk management is practiced as a formal or informal matter, and the language of risk management is not clear. But I'll give you a quick run through it and talk about bag searches with relation to risk management. Risk management starts with risk characterization. That's going through a short laundry list and figuring out what the problem is that you're trying to address. There are basically 4 factors. One is vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is the possibility that something might go wrong. And there are vulnerabilities everywhere, so it's not damning to an enterprise the fact that you have a vulnerability, but recognize vulnerabilities. Other factors go into whether that's important or not. Threat is similar to vulnerability, but it's not anything that could go wrong. It's someone or something that may cause things to go wrong. So it's a little bit narrowing in. In this case, the threat we're talking about is a terrorist of some kind. Then there's the important question. Now, there are threats all over the place as well. And just because there are threats doesn't mean you necessarily have to act. You go to the next step, which is likelihood. What's the chance that this bad thing is going to happen? That's important to know. A lot of it relies on intelligence. A lot of it relies, though, on common awareness of how things work in the world. It's not always easy to figure these things out, but they help you balance your response. The final input into this is consequence. So what happens? What occurs? What's the damage if this bad thing comes to happen? And ultimately, risk is the ethereal measure of likelihood times consequence. How likely is it that it's going to happen, and how consequential is it if it does? You don't necessarily have to come up with a statistical number, a precise figure, but going through that analysis helps you decide what the appropriate measures are and what the less appropriate measures are. When you've done a risk characterization, your next step is to characterize your response. What are we going to do in response, if anything? And the first response to be aware of, that I think is probably one of the most important, is risk acceptance. We accept risks all the time. We're constantly balancing things in our own lives. When you decide to cross the street in the middle of the block rather than going down to the crosswalk, when you eat that double cheeseburger rather than the single burger, that's risk acceptance. You're choosing a little bit more taste over better health. All these things are risk acceptance. And even in the world of terrorism, if you aren't going to be able to cost effectively foreclose some harm coming to pass, risk acceptance is actually the appropriate response. When I speak to politicians and media, I know that I'm violating a cardinal rule that you always have to promise zero risk. But that's absolutely wrong if we're going to protect our civil liberties, our wealth and well-being. So risk acceptance. Then there's prevention. That's taking whatever it is you're trying to protect and altering its circumstances so that the risk you're thinking of is less likely to happen or unlikely to happen. The clear example that we know of from 911 is the hardening of cockpit doors. By putting hard cockpit doors on planes, and in addition the new perspective that passengers and crew have about hijackings, but especially the cockpit doors, make it almost certain. Now it's not a zero risk, but it's a very, very low risk that we'll have the same commandeering style attack on airlines. That's prevention. Airliners are now configured so that commandeering is very, very, very hard. The next, and what we're talking about here with regard to bag searches, is interdiction. That's where you step in front of a threat that's coming your way, or do something to change the threat, to parry the threat. Interdiction is kind of a last line of defense, and you've got a little bit of a problem if your response to a risk is interdiction. Now, of course, interdiction is appropriate if you are aware of a specific threat, a person that has a specific plan on a given day, and the balancing, the finding exactly when you've reached that threshold is something that our friends in law enforcement do all the time. Well, then you step in, and we do ask law enforcement. Even libertarians want law enforcement to be there to do interdiction of genuine motivated attackers. The final potential response is mitigation. That is changing the circumstances of what you're trying to protect, or changing society in the case of terrorism, so that any bad thing happening has less consequence than it otherwise would. In a sense, you're saying that bad thing can happen, and we can respond in a way, we can react in a way that's resilient. We put ourselves back together and go on with the lives that we want to live. When you're choosing responses, there's a whole other set of processes to go through, and that's cost-benefit analysis, which is rather hard to do because you're balancing. It's easiest to balance dollars against dollars, which economists are very good at. It's more challenging when you're balancing dollars and privacy against security. How do you value security? How do you value privacy? Well, we do it in an inductive way through discussions like this, society-wide. We're doing that analysis, but the Department of Homeland Security and the Metro Police Department and WMATA could all do a better job of doing that cost-benefit analysis and articulately balancing these things rather than just pushing against the community for measures like this. And one important dynamic in risk management that's very important to be aware of is risk transfer. That is, you may foreclose some risk in one place, but move the risk to another place quite nearby. And if the threat that we're talking about is the idea of a bomber coming onto the metro, risk transfer is very real. In fact, risk transfer is guaranteed because the program as it's currently instituted would have MPD at some locations and not at others. So, and signage, in fact, which is appropriate, but it's for security, signage that signals the fact that these searches are going on. So someone who is prepared to do something like this, heaven forbid, would go to a different entrance, go to a different metro station, go someplace other than the metro where people congregate. You haven't actually protected the District of Columbia. You haven't actually protected its people by instituting these searches. What you've done, I think, is correctly characterized as security theater. And the final point I want to make is at a very different level of security. We think of security as happening in layers. The last layer, one of the very last layers, is interdiction. One of the most far out layers, I don't mean far out in the sense of liberty, one of the most distant layers from the central problem of immediate security is the strategic layer. Terrorism has the name it does because it's about psychology, it's about what people are thinking, and it's about sending signals. terrorists try to induce fear in us so that we allow our society to come off the rails. We likewise signal things to them by our reaction. If we overreact, we provide encouragement. We empower them in their minds. And if we have in place programs like this, where people are being searched because they're in constant fear of terrorism, people around the world and people in the United States who might want to do this kind of thing are drawn to that because they know they can be more powerful vis-a-vis the district government, vis-a-vis the President of the United States, vis-a-vis all of us if they commit acts of terrorism. If we keep calm and carry on, and if we resist policies like this, we're signaling to terrorists and potential terrorists that it's not going to work. And they'll go on and do something else with their lives, perhaps get a full education, take a job somewhere, and live a happy life. I don't know how many minutes I went, but it was probably too many. Thanks very much for hearing me out.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can hear from